Margaret Ellis still remembers the sound the envelope made when it hit the kitchen counter. It was soft, almost harmless, the kind of sound that should have meant nothing. But after 12 years of waking up before sunrise, 12 years of overtime shifts, 12 years of believing sacrifice would eventually turn into security. That single envelope carried enough weight to destroy an entire life. On the front was her name written in cold black ink. Inside were divorce papers filed by the man she had spent more than a decade building from the ground up. 6 months earlier, Ethan Ellis had stood in a crowded hospital auditorium, wearing a dark blue medical coat while cameras flashed around him.
Thank you.
He smiled
Thank you
for
all.
photographs. He thanked his
First, I want to
professors.
thank God for
He
his
thanked God.
guidance and my
And most
professor.
painfully of all, he thanked his wife for believing in him when nobody else did. Margaret cried during that speech because she thought she was witnessing the reward for years of struggle. What she did not know was that by the time Ethan held that microphone in his hands, he had already been planning his exit for months. There are certain kinds of betrayal that people never truly recover from. Not because of the money involved, not because of the lies, but because of the humiliation that follows when someone realizes they were loved only for what they could provide. And in Margaret's case, the realization came slowly, painfully, and in pieces. First came the divorce papers, then came the bank statements, then came the discovery that while she was working double shifts at a dental clinic outside Milwaukee, Ethan had quietly been building another life without her knowledge. A new apartment, hidden accounts, expensive dinners she never attended, hotel charges in cities he claimed he had never visited. The deeper Margaret looked, the more terrifying the truth became, because this was never a sudden decision made by a stressed husband overwhelmed by work. According to the timeline she would later uncover, Ethan's escape had been carefully organized long before he ever became a doctor. And the worst part was this: Margaret had ignored every warning sign because she loved him too much to believe he could hurt her. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened between Margaret and Ethan Ellis would eventually become one of the most talked about divorce cases in their county, not because of violence or scandal, but because so many people saw themselves inside it. The loyal spouse, the years of sacrifice, the promise that hard times would eventually pay off. Then the crushing realization that while one person was building a future together, the other person was simply building an exit strategy. Margaret met Ethan in the fall of 2007 during a community fundraiser hosted by a local church outside Chicago. At the time, Margaret was 40 years old and already carrying the emotional scars of a difficult first marriage that had ended nearly a decade earlier. Friends described her as dependable, warm, and deeply nurturing. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, checked on neighbors during snowstorms, and spent holidays volunteering at shelters instead of traveling. Ethan was different. He was charismatic in a way that immediately drew attention. He could walk into a room full of strangers and somehow make each person feel personally noticed. He had a sharp sense of humor, easy confidence, and a story that made people root for him almost instantly. Ethan talked openly about growing up in a struggling household after losing his father at a young age. He told people he had once dreamed of becoming a doctor, but abandoned the idea because life got in the way. When Margaret heard him talk about those lost ambitions, she felt something awaken inside her. She later admitted that she believed helping Ethan achieve his dream would also give her own life deeper meaning. The relationship moved quickly. Within 8 months, they were engaged. By the following summer, they were married in a small outdoor ceremony attended by family and close friends. Looking back years later, several guests would quietly admit there were moments during the wedding that now seemed important. Ethan spent most of the evening talking about the future instead of the present. He talked about medical school applications, future income, bigger homes, better neighborhoods, expensive vacations they would someday take together. Margaret interpreted those conversations as ambition. Other people heard something else. Still, nobody questioned the relationship openly because Margaret looked genuinely happy. After years of loneliness, she finally believed she had found someone who saw her value. At first, their marriage looked ordinary. They rented a modest home in Wisconsin. Margaret continued working as a dental assistant, while Ethan took prerequisite science courses at a nearby college. Money was tight almost immediately. Tuition costs piled up faster than expected. Ethan's study schedule became more demanding. Margaret picked up extra shifts to cover groceries and utilities. Then she started working weekends. Then holidays. Friends noticed she looked exhausted all the time. But whenever somebody expressed concern, she defended Ethan instantly. She called him driven, focused, dedicated. She told people sacrifice was temporary, and that someday all their struggles would be worth it. By the time Ethan was accepted into medical school 3 years later, Margaret had already drained most of her savings helping support them. But she never complained publicly. In fact, she appeared proud of the sacrifices she was making. She refinanced her home to help cover tuition gaps. She sold family jewelry inherited from her mother. She canceled vacations year after year. At one point, she even took overnight reception work at a rehabilitation clinic so Ethan could reduce his own hours and focus entirely on studying. People close to Margaret began noticing a dangerous imbalance forming inside the marriage. Ethan's future was constantly expanding, while Margaret's world kept getting smaller. Her social life disappeared. Her hobbies vanished. Her physical health declined from stress and lack of sleep. Yet she remained convinced that love required endurance. Then came the first moment that quietly changed everything. During Ethan's second year of medical school, Margaret attended a university networking dinner where spouses were invited. She spent hours carefully getting ready, because Ethan rarely brought her around classmates or faculty members. That night, Margaret walked into a room filled with younger couples, expensive dresses, polished conversations, and people who came from completely different worlds. Ethan barely introduced her to anyone. When she tried joining conversations, people smiled politely before turning back toward discussions about research opportunities and hospital placements. Margaret later admitted that was the first night she felt embarrassed around her husband, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because Ethan acted like he no longer knew where she fit into his new life. What Margaret did not realize was that Ethan had already started changing in ways she could not yet fully understand. Success was beginning to reshape his identity. The more recognition he received from professors and hospital staff, the more distant he became at home. He corrected Margaret publicly over small things. He criticized the way she dressed. He started making comments about her education level during arguments. Sometimes he would come from class and spend entire evenings on his phone, while barely speaking to her. Then came the passwords, the hidden notifications, the sudden obsession with fitness and appearance. Margaret noticed all of it, but every explanation Ethan gave sounded reasonable enough to silence her doubts. Medical school was stressful. Residency applications were competitive. Hospital hours were brutal. She convinced herself the distance was temporary. But during Ethan's residency at a private hospital outside Minneapolis, another name quietly entered the story. Her name was Vanessa Carter. She was a pharmaceutical representative in her early 30s who regularly visited the hospital where Ethan worked. Attractive, polished, and socially connected, Vanessa moved comfortably through the medical world Ethan desperately wanted to belong to. The first time Margaret heard her name was almost accidental. Ethan mentioned a group dinner after work and casually referred to Vanessa while talking about hospital politics. Margaret thought nothing of it. Weeks later, Ethan brought up Vanessa again while describing a conference event. Then came late-night text alerts. Ethan suddenly refused to explain. Margaret asked simple questions at first. Ethan answered with irritation instead of reassurance. That was when fear quietly entered the marriage for the first time. Margaret tried to convince herself that insecurity was making her paranoid. For weeks, she replayed every conversation in her mind, searching for proof that she was imagining things. Ethan had become colder, yes, but coldness alone did not mean betrayal. She told herself that hospitals changed people, stress changed people, long hours changed people. But deep down, another truth had already started forming inside her. Ethan no longer looked at her the way he once had. The warmth was gone. The gratitude was gone. Even his silence felt different now, calculated and impatient, as though every conversation with her had become an obligation he needed to tolerate rather than enjoy. One night, after waiting nearly 3 hours past the time Ethan promised he would be home, Margaret called his phone repeatedly with no answer. When he finally arrived close to midnight, he smelled faintly of expensive perfume. Margaret noticed it immediately. Ethan saw the expressions on her face and became defensive before she even spoke. He accused her of acting unstable. He claimed the scent came from hugging coworkers after a long shift. Then he looked directly at her and said something Margaret would never forget. You're starting to sound jealous of my success." The sentence hit harder than any scream ever could, because it revealed what Ethan truly thought about her. From that moment forward, Margaret stopped feeling like a wife and started feeling like an inconvenience. Still, she stayed. People often ask why loyal partners ignore obvious signs for so long, but the answer is painfully simple. Hope can make intelligent people deny reality for years. Margaret kept believing the man she married was still somewhere underneath the growing distance. She believed once residency ended, things would improve. She believed once the financial pressure eased, Ethan would become himself again. So she continued supporting him. She continued paying bills. She continued waking up before dawn while Ethan climbed closer toward the life they once promised each other. And when Ethan officially completed residency and accepted a permanent position at a respected hospital in Illinois, Margaret thought they had finally reached the finish line. Friends congratulated them constantly. Family members called their marriage inspiring. Ethan's graduation ceremony felt like a public celebration of endurance. During his speech, Ethan became emotional while thanking Margaret. He spoke about her sacrifices in front of hundreds of people. Some audience members cried while listening. Margaret cried hardest of all. Later that night, Ethan kissed her forehead and said, "Everything changes now." What Margaret did not know was that he was telling the truth in a completely different way. Over the next 6 months, Ethan's behavior shifted rapidly. He spent more money than ever before, but became secretive whenever Margaret asked questions. New suits appeared in the closet. Expensive watches she had never seen before sat on bathroom counters. He suddenly insisted on separate banking access because he claimed doctors needed financial independence. Margaret noticed he guarded his phone constantly now, even carrying it into the shower. Whenever she entered a room unexpectedly, conversations ended immediately. One evening, Margaret reached for Ethan's laptop to order groceries and found herself locked out by a new password. Ethan laughed awkwardly and claimed the hospital required stronger cybersecurity protections. Margaret wanted desperately to believe him. But then came the anniversary dinner that changed everything. It happened at a downtown steakhouse Ethan had chosen himself. Margaret arrived excited because they had not spent real time together in months. Ethan barely touched his food all evening. His answers became shorter and shorter until silence settled between them like fog. Finally, Ethan placed his fork down, stared at the table, and said the sentence that shattered the last remaining piece of Margaret's world. "I don't think this marriage works anymore." At first, Margaret genuinely thought he was joking because the words felt impossible. 12 years together. 12 years of sacrifice. 12 years spent building his future. And suddenly he was speaking like someone ending a business arrangement. Margaret asked if there was somebody else. Ethan denied it immediately, but he avoided eye contact while answering. Then he said something even more painful. "We've grown into different people." Margaret later described that moment as feeling her entire body go numb. Everything after that conversation became fragmented memories. The drive home, the silence, Ethan sleeping in the guest room, the sound of drawers opening late at night while he quietly packed bags. 3 days later, the envelope arrived. Margaret sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at legal documents she could barely process through tears. Ethan had already hired attorneys. The filing date revealed he began preparing for divorce weeks before their anniversary dinner. Every detail had been organized in advance: shared assets, financial disclosures, property separation, temporary living arrangements. The marriage was already ending legally before Margaret even realized it was in danger emotionally. Ethan moved into a luxury apartment downtown less than 48 hours later. Margaret would eventually discover he signed the lease nearly 2 months earlier. For several weeks after the separation, Margaret barely functioned. Friends took turns checking on her. Because she stopped answering calls regularly, she lost weight rapidly. Some mornings she remained sitting in the same chair for hours, unable to process what had happened. But the shock slowly transformed into suspicion after small financial inconsistencies began appearing. Bills went unpaid despite Ethan claiming he transferred money. Savings accounts contained less than expected. Credit card balances looked unfamiliar. Margaret finally contacted a divorce attorney named Linda Carver, a woman with nearly 30 years of experience handling high-conflict separations. Within days, Linda noticed patterns that immediately concerned her. Money had been moved systematically over time. Joint funds disappeared gradually in amounts small enough to avoid attention. New accounts existed Margaret had never seen before. Ethan had not simply decided to leave. According to Linda, he had been preparing financially for at least a year. Then came the discovery that changed the entire case. While organizing old tax documents, Margaret found hotel receipts connected to medical conferences Ethan attended during residency. One receipt included charges for luxury spa services and expensive dining for 2 people. The dates matched weekends Ethan claimed he spent studying overnight at the hospital. Linda hired an investigator who eventually uncovered photographs of Ethan and Vanessa Carter vacationing together nearly 18 months before the divorce filing. The affair had been happening while Margaret was still paying off tuition debt connected to Ethan's education. When Margaret saw the photographs, she reportedly became physically ill, not simply because Ethan cheated, but because she realized he had looked her in the eyes for years while secretly planning a future that did not include her. The deeper investigators looked, the worse the truth became. Ethan and Vanessa had attended social events publicly together months before the divorce. Several coworkers already knew about the relationship, but assumed the marriage had quietly ended. Ethan had allegedly told people Margaret was emotionally unstable and incapable of understanding the demands of his career. He portrayed himself as trapped inside an unhappy marriage, built on obligation rather than love. Meanwhile, Margaret was still working overtime to help cover lingering educational expenses attached to Ethan's medical training. Friends who once admired Ethan now started distancing themselves after learning how long the deception had lasted. But the most devastating discovery came from Ethan's own messages. During legal proceedings, financial subpoenas exposed private conversations between Ethan and Vanessa, discussing timelines for the divorce. In one message, Ethan referred to his marriage as a chapter that served its purpose. In another, he discussed waiting until his first attending physician contract became official before filing because it would provide more stability moving forward. Margaret read those messages alone inside Linda's office and reportedly cried so hard she could barely breathe. Everything she feared suddenly became undeniable. Ethan had not simply fallen out of love. He had used her support to build the exact life he wanted before carefully removing her from it. When the case finally reached court nearly a year later, public interest around the story exploded locally. Reporters framed it as the ultimate betrayal marriage case. Older women especially reacted emotionally because many saw pieces of themselves inside Margaret's story. During testimony, Ethan remained composed and professional, often speaking about the divorce in detached, practical language. But under questioning from Linda Carver, cracks slowly began appearing. Financial records showed deliberate asset transfers. Timeline evidence contradicted Ethan's earlier claims about when the affair began. Most importantly, Linda argued that Margaret's sacrifices directly enabled Ethan's medical success, while he intentionally concealed plans to abandon the marriage once financial security arrived. Then came the moment nobody expected. During cross-examination, Linda asked Ethan a simple question. Did you love your wife while she was supporting you through medical school? Ethan paused for nearly 10 seconds before answering. That silence changed the atmosphere of the courtroom completely, because for the first time people saw uncertainty inside him. Ethan finally answered quietly, I think I did at one point. Margaret looked down immediately after hearing those words, not crying, not angry, just empty. Later, she admitted that answer hurt more than discovering the affair, because it confirmed her greatest fear. Somewhere along the way, she stopped being a person to Ethan and became part of a strategy. The judge ultimately ruled heavily in Margaret's favor financially. Ethan was ordered to provide a substantial settlement, tied partly to contributions Margaret made toward his education and living expenses throughout the marriage. Legal analysts later noted that the ruling reflected clear evidence of financial manipulation leading up to the divorce. But, despite the courtroom victory, Margaret left feeling emotionally hollow. No amount of money could return the years she lost, believing she was building a shared future. And then, almost unbelievably, another twist emerged. Less than 8 months after the divorce finalized, Vanessa Carter left Ethan. According to mutual acquaintances, Ethan's long work hours and growing reputation around the divorce case created tension inside their relationship. Some claimed Vanessa became uncomfortable with public criticism once details of the affair spread online. Others believed she simply lost interest after realizing Ethan carried enormous emotional baggage and financial obligations from the settlement. Whatever the reason, the relationship collapsed quickly. Ethan reportedly attempted reconnecting with old friends afterward, but many had already distanced themselves permanently. Meanwhile, Margaret slowly began rebuilding her life in ways nobody expected. She started attending therapy regularly. She reconnected with family members she had neglected for years during Ethan's education. She traveled alone for the first time in decades. She joined painting classes. She even began mentoring divorced women at a local community center, helping others recognize warning signs she once ignored herself. Friends noticed something remarkable over time. The sadness remained, but the shame disappeared. Margaret stopped blaming herself for Ethan's choices. She stopped believing she failed as a wife simply because someone else lacked loyalty. Nearly 3 years after the divorce, Ethan mailed Margaret a handwritten letter. In it, he apologized for the pain he caused and admitted he spent years chasing success, believing it would finally make him feel complete. Instead, according to the letter, he destroyed the only person who truly cared about him before he became successful. Margaret read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a drawer without responding. Some people expected anger, others expected forgiveness, but Margaret later explained she felt neither. By the time the apology came, she said quietly during an interview years later, the woman who needed it no longer existed. Today, Margaret's story continues spreading online because it touches something painfully human. Most people are not afraid of hard times. They are afraid of sacrificing everything for someone who was already planning to leave. And perhaps that is why this story stays with people long after it ends. Because somewhere tonight, another person is working overtime for somebody they trust completely. Another person is convincing themselves exhaustion means love. Another person is ignoring small warning signs because facing the truth feels too terrifying. The hardest part about betrayal is not discovering someone lied to you. It is realizing your loyalty existed inside a story the other person stopped believing long before you did. And now we want to hear from you. Do you think Ethan ever truly loved Margaret? Or was she simply part of his plan from the beginning? Have you ever seen someone sacrifice everything for a relationship that ultimately destroyed them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of love, deception, betrayal, and survival.